What if the most intelligent creature watching you from a tree branch isn't watching you at all, but studying you? Crows remember faces, they hold grudges, they solve puzzles that would challenge a 5-year-old child, they use tools, make tools, mourn their dead, and pass information down through generations like a kind of oral tradition written in calls and feathers, and they do all of this with a brain no larger than a walnut. Welcome to the Calm Science Sleep. Wherever you are tonight, whether you're tucked into bed with the lights already dim, or resting on a couch with the world growing quieter around you, I'm glad you found your way here. Tonight we're going to drift slowly through one of the most astonishing stories in all of nature, the story of the crow, not the cartoon version, not the omen perched on a fence post in a horror film, but the real crow, the one that scientists have spent decades studying with growing disbelief, the one that has been slowly, quietly rewriting what we think we know about the nature of intelligence itself. You don't need to take notes or stay fully awake. Just let the ideas wash over you. Some will stay with you, others will drift away like the end of a dream. Either way, you'll fall asleep knowing a little more about a creature that has been watching us, learning from us, and perhaps understanding us far better than we ever understood it. And if these slow, curious journeys are the kind of thing that helps you rest, I'd be truly grateful if you tapped the like button or subscribe to the channel. It helps others find their way here too. One sleepy mind at a time. Now take a breath, let your shoulders drop, and let's begin. Crows belong to a family of birds called corvids, which also includes ravens, magpies, jackdaws, jays, and rooks. The family has been around for tens of millions of years, evolving across nearly every continent on Earth except Antarctica. And in that time, something unusual happened inside their skulls. Their brains grew disproportionately large relative to their body size. Not as large as ours, of course, but if you were to compare brain-to-body ratios across the animal kingdom, corvids would land not far from where chimpanzees and dolphins sit, and that company alone should tell you something. For a long time, scientists were reluctant to credit birds with much cognitive depth. There was a prevailing assumption, reasonable on its surface, that intelligence required a cerebral cortex, the layered outer structure of the mammalian brain that handles things like planning, reasoning, and imagination. Birds don't have one. Their brains are built differently, and so for decades, they were largely dismissed as instinct-driven automatons, creatures responding to the world rather than thinking about it. That assumption has been dismantled piece by careful piece over the last half-century, and much of the work that dismantled it involved crows. Let's start with something deceptively simple, the problem of the floating peanut. In experiments conducted at several research institutions, crows were presented with a narrow vertical tube partially filled with water. At the bottom of the tube, just out of reach, floated a small piece of food. The tube was too narrow for the crow's beak. There was no stick nearby, no hook, nothing that looked like an obvious tool. But beside the tube sat a collection of small stones. The crows dropped stones into the tube, one by one, patiently watching the water level rise. When the food floated close enough to the surface, they reached in and took it. Now, this might not sound extraordinary at first. Animals have learned to use tools before. Chimpanzees strip leaves from twigs and push them into termite mounds. Sea otters crack shells against rocks balanced on their chests. But what made the crow experiments remarkable was what came next. When researchers replaced the stones with objects that were hollow and would not raise the water level, the crows chose the solid ones preferentially. When given a choice between sand and water as the medium, they chose water. When the tube was placed near a second tube that was filled with water but not connected to the first, they ignored it. They were not just applying a learned rule. They were reasoning. They were demonstrating an intuitive understanding of water displacement, of cause and effect, of the physical properties of the world around them. An understanding so sophisticated that it was once thought to be uniquely the domain of human children around the age of 5 or 6. The experiments drew immediate comparisons to Aesop's fable of the crow and the pitcher, a story nearly 3,000 years old in which a thirsty crow, unable to drink from a partially filled jar, drops stones into it one by one until the water rises high enough to drink. Scientists had always treated this as a charming folk tale. It turned out to be field notes. This is one of the things that makes studying crows so quietly humbling. The folk wisdom about their intelligence predated the science by centuries. People who lived closely with these birds, farmers, fishermen, children who played near parks, had always sensed something watching back from behind those dark eyes. It took laboratories and controlled experiments to confirm what ordinary observation had already suggested. But tool use is just the beginning. In the forests of New Caledonia, a remote island in the South Pacific, there lives a subspecies called the New Caledonian crow, and this particular bird does something no other non-human animal was known to do before scientists discovered it. It doesn't just use tools, it makes them. New Caledonian crows craft hooks. They take slender twigs or strips of plant material, bend and shape them using their beaks and feet, and then use these hooks to extract grubs and insects from narrow crevices in wood. The tools are shaped differently depending on the task. Longer hooks for deeper holes, shorter, stiffer ones for situations requiring more force. They are not picking up objects and applying them. They are manufacturing instruments tailored to specific jobs. In 2018, a team of researchers in Cambridge gave a New Caledonian crow named Betty a piece of straight wire and a task that required a hooked tool. She had never seen wire before. Within a few minutes, she had bent it into a hook by wedging one end into a crevice and curling the other with her beak. Then she used it to retrieve the food. The researchers were stunned, not because a crow had used a hook, but because a crow had spontaneously invented one in a completely novel material to solve a problem it had never faced before. That is not instinct. That is something very close to what we call insight. The sudden understanding of a solution without trial and error. The mental representation of a goal and a path toward it. New Caledonian crows also stockpile their tools, storing them in specific locations, carrying them from task to task, and appearing to plan ahead for uses they anticipate, rather than simply reacting to immediate need. They will sometimes hold a tool in their beak while investigating a potential foraging site, as though already preparing for a task they haven't yet begun. This kind of prospective thinking, the ability to mentally simulate a future state and act in preparation for it, is another cognitive milestone that was once thought to be exclusively human. Philosophers called it mental time travel, the ability to project your mind into imagined futures, not just to respond to the present moment, but to inhabit a scenario that doesn't yet exist. Crows, it turns out, can do this. In one particularly elegant study, crows were given access to a vending machine-like device that dispensed tokens. The tokens could then be exchanged for food at a separate location, but only on certain days and only at certain times. The crows learned the system. They collected tokens, stored them, and presented them at the right time and place to receive their reward. They were planning for a tomorrow that they could not yet see. Let that settle for a moment. A bird with a walnut-sized brain, planning for tomorrow. It is the kind of fact that becomes more astonishing the longer you sit with it. Because planning for the future requires more than memory. It requires imagination. You have to be able to hold in your mind a state of the world that does not currently exist, inhabit it as if it were real, and make decisions now based on what you anticipate then. That is a high cognitive bar. And crows clear it. Now there's a particular area of crow cognition that I find especially beautiful, and it has to do with the way they relate to each other. Because crows are not solitary animals, they live in complex social structures with stable relationships, recognized hierarchies, and something that looks very much like politics. When two crows meet, they know who the other one is, not just whether the other is a crow or a hawk or a human, but who, specifically, that individual is. They recognize the faces, voices, and behavioral signatures of other crows they have encountered before. And they remember the context of those encounters. A crow that lost a fight to another crow months ago will behave differently around that specific crow than it does around others. It holds social memory across time. They also appear to understand relationships between third parties. A crow watching two other crows interact can track the outcome of that interaction and update its understanding of the social hierarchy accordingly, even if it was not personally involved. This is called transitive inference, the ability to conclude that if A beats B and B beats C, then A probably beats C. It is a form of abstract reasoning about social structure. Humans use it constantly. Most animals cannot do it at all. Crows can. And then there is the matter of the funeral. In 2009, Kaylee Swift, a researcher then at the University of Washington, began studying a behaviour that had been observed anecdotally for years but never systematically investigated. Crows, when they encounter a dead member of their species, will sometimes gather around the body in large numbers. They call out, they land nearby, they appear to examine the body, sometimes approaching and retreating repeatedly, and then they leave. Swift designed an experiment to understand what was happening. She and her colleagues donned masks when approaching dead crows that had been placed in public areas and observed how nearby crows responded. The crows that had seen the masked person near a dead crow remembered that mask. For weeks afterward, they would alarm call when they saw a person wearing that same mask, even when the person was carrying nothing and behaving neutrally. They had associated that face with death and tagged it as dangerous. But why gather at all? What does the crow get from standing near a dead member of its species calling and watching? Swift's research suggests these gatherings function as information-gathering events. Living crows learn from the presence of a dead crow where danger lies. They associate the location, the circumstances, and any nearby stimuli with threat. The gathering is not purely emotional, though it may involve something like that too. It is partly educational, partly social, and it is passed on. Other crows that weren't present but later saw the gathering taking place would also learn to avoid the area and alarm call at the associated stimuli. What this means is that crows transmit cultural knowledge across individuals and across generations. A crow that has never personally experienced a hawk attack can learn to fear hawks from watching other crows respond to them. Information flows through crow communities the way it flows through human communities, not just through instinct, but through observation, communication, and memory. This is the definition of culture in its most basic sense. Learned behaviour that spreads socially rather than genetically. Humans have it, great apes have limited versions of it, and crows have it too. The University of Washington has produced a great deal of the most compelling research on crow cognition, and much of it began with an unusual observation in the mid-2000s. Local crows in the Seattle area had begun to recognise and respond to the face of a particular researcher, John Marsluff, who had been trapping and banding them for a population study. When Marsluff walked through campus wearing the same face he wore during the trapping operations, the crows would dive-bomb him, calling out in alarm. When he wore a mask of a different face while doing the same work, the crows ignored him. They had not memorized his badge or his uniform, they had memorized his face. Marsluff and his colleagues began testing this more rigorously. Volunteers wore caveman masks while trapping crows, and neutral masks while simply walking through the same areas without trapping. Over the following months, the researchers tracked which crows scolded which masks. The results were striking. Not only did crows that had been trapped scold the dangerous mask, but other crows who had not been personally trapped also began to scold it, having apparently learned from the reactions of their flockmates, and the response spread geographically. Crows in areas far from the original trapping sites also began responding to the mask. The information had moved through the crow community like a rumour, wordless but effective, and it had done so in something that can only be described as a social network. Years later, the caveman mask still elicits scolding from Seattle crows, even though the original trappers have long since moved on. The knowledge has outlasted the individuals who first acquired it. That is cultural transmission. That is a form of tradition. This capacity for social learning extends to foraging. Crows will observe where other animals, including humans, hide food. They watch, they wait, and when the coast is clear, they return and retrieve the hidden cache. This creates a kind of surveillance awareness in crows that borders on the uncanny. Studies have found that crows in the act of caching their own food will stop, look around for observers, and if another crow is watching, either cover their cache more carefully, or more interestingly, create a fake cache in a visible location to deceive the observer while hiding the real food elsewhere when attention has been diverted. Read that again for a moment. Crows stage decoy behaviours to mislead observers. They are not just responding to their environment, they are modelling other minds. They are thinking about what another individual can see, what that individual might do with that information, and how to manipulate the situation accordingly. In cognitive science, this ability is called theory of mind, the understanding that other individuals have mental states, beliefs, and perspectives that may differ from your own. It is a cornerstone of human social intelligence, It underlies empathy, deception, cooperation, and language. It was once thought to be uniquely human. Then we found it in great apes. Then, more controversially, in dolphins and elephants. And now, increasingly, in corvids. The crow who fakes a food cache is doing something very specific. It is thinking, in some functional sense, about the thoughts of another crow. It is asking, in effect, what does that crow believe, and how can I change that belief? That is a sophisticated mental operation, and the crow performs it spontaneously, without training, as a natural part of its social life. These deceptive caching behaviours are particularly well developed in Eurasian jays, a close cousin to the crow. Jays will not only create false caches when observed, but they will move their real caches after being watched, returning to the original site and relocating the food when the observer is no longer present. And crucially, only jays that have themselves stolen food from other birds engage in this kind of countermeasure. Jays that have never been thieves don't seem to worry as much about being stolen from. It is as if the experience of deception creates an understanding that deception exists, and that understanding then shapes behaviour in a reciprocally protective way. The thief understands theft because it is a thief. The mind that can commit a social act can also imagine that act being committed against itself. There is something very human in that. Let's move for a moment into the territory of play. Because crows play, genuine, purposeless, apparently joyful play. They have been observed sliding down snow-covered rooftops repeatedly, climbing back up and sliding down again. There is no food involved. There is no predator being evaded. There is no obvious survival benefit. They are by every available measure just having fun. Ravens will hang upside down from branches for no apparent reason. Jackdaws engage in aerial acrobatics that serve no functional purpose. Young crows play tug-of-war with objects, chase each other in mock pursuits, and toss things into the air before catching them. Play is something that tends to appear in animals with complex brains and extended development periods. The young of many species play because play is a form of practice. Predators learn to hunt. Social animals learn to navigate relationships. But play also appears to be enjoyable in some intrinsic sense, meaning that the animal is not just practicing, it is experiencing something positive. In humans, we call this pleasure. In crows, we can only describe the behaviour and note that it looks, by every external measure, like what joy looks like. Play is important here not just because it is charming, which it is, but because it suggests something about the inner life of these animals. An animal without any form of inner experience, an animal that is purely mechanical, does not play for its own sake. Play implies a subject, something it is like to be the animal doing the playing. It implies that the crow's experience of sliding down a snowy roof is, in some functional sense, good. We cannot know what it feels like to be a crow. That is a limit we should be honest about. But we can observe behaviour, and behaviour tells us something. And what the behaviour of crows tells us is that these are animals with something to lose, not just resources and survival, but the particular texture of a life that includes curiosity, pleasure, relationships, and loss. Which brings us gently to grief. The crow funeral behaviour described earlier is not the only evidence of something like mourning in corvids. Observers have reported ravens staying near the body of a dead companion for extended periods, appearing agitated and subdued. Mated pairs of crows, which often stay together for years, show behavioural changes after the loss of a partner that look very much like grief in its early stages. Reduced activity, loss of interest in food, changed calling patterns. These behaviours are not definitive evidence of subjective suffering, but they are suggestive, and they add to a picture of a social animal for whom other individuals matter. In one story that has become something of a legend among researchers, a pair of crows nested year after year in the same tree near a university campus. One year, the female was found dead nearby, apparently struck by a vehicle. The male was observed returning to the nest for several days afterward, calling into the empty space where she had been, landing and looking, then flying off again. He did not nest in that location the following season. What can we make of that? Probably not certainty, but possibly compassion. The recognition that here was a creature for whom the absence of another creature was felt. Now, There is a particular thread in the study of crow intelligence that runs deeper than any single experiment or observation. It is the question of what all of this intelligence is for. Why did crows evolve such sophisticated cognitive abilities? What pressures shaped a brain capable of tool manufacture, social deception, future planning, and face recognition? The most compelling answer, supported by substantial research, is that crow intelligence evolved primarily in response to the social demands of crow life. Living in large, complex, stable groups with shifting alliances and individual relationships creates enormous cognitive pressure. You need to remember who you've interacted with and how. You need to predict how others will behave. You need to track your own reputation and manage it. You need to cooperate with some individuals while competing with others, sometimes simultaneously. You need to learn from others and teach your own knowledge in turn. This is essentially the same argument that has been made about the evolution of human intelligence. The social brain hypothesis holds that it was the complexity of human social life, not the demands of tool use or environment, that drove the rapid expansion of the human brain. The relentless complexity of tracking relationships in large groups, of maintaining alliances, managing rivals, building coalitions, and anticipating the actions of dozens of other individuals placed extreme demands on cognitive ability, and those demands drove selection for larger, more flexible, more socially sophisticated brains. If that is what drove human intelligence, then it is not surprising that we find similarly high cognition in other animals that live in complex fluid social groups: dolphins, elephants, great apes, and corvids. The ecological context is different for each, but the core cognitive challenge is the same: living well among others who are also smart, also strategic, and also competing for resources and status. In this light, the crow's intelligence is not an accident or a curiosity. It is the predictable outcome of living in a social world complicated enough to require it. And there is something almost quietly moving about that. The thought that minds like ours emerge not from solitude and contemplation, but from the tangled, daily, relentlessly demanding business of getting along with each other. Intelligence as a gift given not by paradise, but by company. Crows also show a remarkable capacity for numerical reasoning. In controlled experiments, crows have been trained to recognize quantities of objects and to select arrays containing specific numbers. They can distinguish 2 from 3, 3 from 4, and perform simple comparisons across quantities up to around 7 or 8. They will match a sample quantity to a target quantity even when the objects involved are completely different in appearance, size, and color, responding to the abstract concept of number rather than any specific perceptual feature. This is not counting in the way humans count, but it is something importantly related to it: the ability to represent abstract numerical magnitude. To understand that 3 of anything is more than 2 of anything requires a mental abstraction that goes well beyond simple pattern matching, and crows have it. In one delightful experiment, crows were trained to expect a certain number of items hidden inside a set of boxes. When the number of items inside the boxes was secretly reduced, the crows would open more boxes than were actually present, as if searching for the missing items. They had formed an expectation about quantity, and were surprised when that expectation was violated. They knew that something was missing, even though they couldn't see what. An awareness of absence is, in its own quiet way, a form of abstract thinking. You have to know what should be there in order to notice what isn't. There is another dimension of crow cognition worth dwelling on for a moment, and that is the question of mirror self-recognition. The mirror test, first developed by psychologist Gordon Gallup Jr. in 1970, involves placing a small mark on an animal in a location it cannot see without a mirror, and then observing whether the animal uses a mirror to investigate the mark on its own body. If it does, the argument goes, it must recognize the image in the mirror as itself, which implies a degree of self-awareness. Humans pass this test. Great apes pass it. Dolphins pass it. Elephants pass it. One species of magpie, the Eurasian magpie, also passes it, making it the first non-mammal known to do so. Researchers placed a coloured spot on the throat of magpies in a position they couldn't see without a mirror, and several individuals responded by scratching at the spot while looking at their reflection and ignoring control spots placed where they could feel but not see them. The magpie looked in the mirror and recognized itself. This is not, researchers are careful to say, conclusive proof of human-style self-consciousness. Mirror self-recognition is a behavioral test, and there are legitimate debates about what exactly it demonstrates. But it is evidence of something, an awareness of self as a body in space, a recognition that the image in the mirror corresponds to one's own appearance, a sense of me that is distinct from you. Whether crows specifically pass the mirror test is less clear. Formal studies with the same rigour as the magpie research have not been completed, but informal observation suggests that crows at least orient to mirrors in ways that are distinct from their response to other birds, examining themselves with what appears to be curiosity rather than aggression toward a perceived intruder. The question remains open, but the magpie has walked through the door. Let's talk about communication, because crows don't just make noise, they communicate. Crow vocalizations are enormously varied. Different calls serve different purposes. There are alarm calls for aerial predators and separate alarm calls for terrestrial predators. There are assembly calls, contact calls between mated pairs, calls associated with food discovery, calls used during aggressive encounters, and softer calls used between parents and offspring. Research into crow calls suggests that listeners, both crows and in some studies, humans who have spent a great deal of time around them, can extract meaningful information from these vocalizations even without prior training. But beyond calls, crows communicate through gesture and behavior. They will turn their head to direct another crow's attention to an object. They will point with their beaks, in a manner analogous to pointing with a finger, towards something they want another individual to notice. This kind of referential gesture, directing attention towards something outside of oneself, was once thought to be limited to humans and to a lesser extent great apes. Crows do it, and they appear to understand it when it is directed at them. In social interactions, crows use body posture, feather position, and movement in highly nuanced ways that communicate status, intention, and emotion. Two crows negotiating over a food item enact a complex exchange of signals: feathers slightly raised, head tilted at a precise angle, wings held in one position rather than another, each gesture carrying information that the other crow reads and responds to. This is a form of language in the broadest sense, not language with grammar and syntax, but a rich system of shared signals that transmit meaning between individuals. And the individuals on both ends of that exchange are interpreting, not just reacting. They are reading each other. Ravens, the larger corvid cousins of crows, take this further still. Studies by Thomas Bugnier in Austria have shown that ravens not only communicate with each other, but actively seek out allies when facing conflicts with third parties. A raven that has been involved in a dispute will approach specific individuals, make contact gestures, and appear to recruit support. The recruited raven may then intervene in the conflict on behalf of its ally. This is coalition building. It requires understanding that another individual has the capacity to help you, that the relationship between you matters, and that your current need can be communicated and acted upon. These are not simple behaviours. They are the building blocks of politics, of friendship, and of the complex webs of obligation and support that characterise human social life. Ravens also console each other after conflicts. Affiliative contact gestures, gentle preening, sitting close, have been observed following aggressive encounters, most commonly initiated by bystanders toward the loser of the altercation. The loser is soothed. Its stress levels, as measured by cortisol metabolites and droppings, decrease. The comforting behaviour appears to reduce distress. Consolation, the reaching out to relieve distress in another, is a behaviour that requires understanding that the other individual is in distress, caring about that distress, and taking action to reduce it. That is empathy in its functional form, not just emotional contagion, the involuntary catching of another's emotional state, but a directed response to perceived suffering. We are made for each other, it seems, not just humans, crows, ravens, these dark, brilliant birds wheeling through the sky above our cities and fields, watching us, learning from us, remembering us. They have needs and preferences and memories and relationships and something that, in the broadest sense, might be called feelings, and all of it is happening in a brain that fits in a teaspoon. Which raises a question that has quietly haunted me through this entire exploration. If intelligence like this can evolve in a creature so different from us, in a body plan so radically different from ours, then what does that tell us about intelligence itself? The answer, I think, is something humbling and beautiful. It tells us that intelligence is not a single thing. It is not a property confined to one architecture or one lineage or one planet. It is a solution to a problem, the problem of surviving in a complex world. And complex worlds make complex minds, however those minds are built. The crow did not evolve human intelligence. It evolved crow intelligence, adapted for crow life, crow society, crow problems. Its brain is structured differently from ours. Its sensory world is different. Its emotional landscape is different. But when the problems it faces are similar to ours, when it needs to plan, to deceive, to remember, to cooperate, to learn from others, to maintain relationships across time, it arrives at solutions that look remarkably like the solutions we arrived at. Not because crows are tiny feathered humans, but because intelligence, in all its forms, is answering the same kinds of questions. Questions about what exists in the world, what will happen next, and what to do about it. There's a researcher named Alex Taylor at the University of Auckland who has spent years working with New Caledonian crows. In one of his studies, he designed a multi-step puzzle that required crows to first use a short stick to retrieve a longer stick from a separate location, and then use the longer stick to retrieve a stone, and then use the stone to unlock a box containing food. The task required 3 sequential steps, each one enabling the next, none of them individually sufficient. The crows solved it. In some cases, they appeared to pause and survey the entire apparatus before making a move, as though mentally rehearsing the sequence. Taylor has been careful not to overinterpret this, but the behaviour is consistent with planning, with what researchers call hierarchical action sequencing, the ability to mentally represent a chain of events and work through them in order toward a distant goal. When a crow pauses at the beginning of a complex task and then moves purposefully through each step, it is doing something architecturally similar to what happens when a human plans a complicated project. Not identical, not as abstract or as linguistically mediated, but structurally analogous, a mind representing the future and working backward from a goal. Now, I want to spend a moment on something that often goes undiscussed in the popular coverage of crow intelligence, and that is the extraordinary individuality of these birds. Because when you spend time reading about crow research, what becomes clear very quickly is that crows are not interchangeable. Individual birds have distinct personalities, distinct skill levels, distinct preferences, distinct quirks. Some crows are bold and inventive, the first to approach a novel object or attempt a new solution. Others are cautious and methodical, watching from a distance before engaging. Some are highly social, central nodes in their community networks. Others are peripheral and solitary. Some are skilled tool users. Others never develop the same facility even when given the same opportunities. This variability is not random noise. It reflects genuine individual differences in temperament and ability. And it matters, because individual variability is the raw material on which social learning operates. The bold, inventive crow that discovers a new food source or a new technique is the node through which that information enters the community. Others observe, others copy, the discovery spreads, and the crow that made it has left a mark on its culture. This is how culture works. Not through the average performance of a group, but through the exceptional contributions of individuals whose innovations get picked up and transmitted. Crows have innovators. They have followers. They have skeptics who watch and wait before committing. They have, in a word, characters. In a long-term study of crow communities in Corvallis, Oregon, individual crows were found to have consistent personalities that could be rated by human observers with reasonable agreement. Some birds were reliably exploratory. Others were reliably avoidant. These personality differences persisted across time and across contexts. They were, in the relevant sense, real. Not tricks of observation or artifacts of sample size, but genuine stable features of individual animals. A crow has a personality. A crow is somebody. And I think there is something important in pausing to let that register. Not because it is sentimentally satisfying, though it is that too, but because it has real implications for how we think about non-human minds. We are accustomed to thinking about animals as species, as populations as statistical averages. But individual animals are not averages. They are individuals. They have histories and idiosyncrasies and trajectories. They learn different things and become different from each other through the particular experiences of their particular lives. The crow that grew up near a university campus and learned to steal sandwiches from students is not the same crow as the one that grew up in a forest and learned to crack nuts by dropping them on busy roads. Same species, same cognitive architecture, radically different life, and that is worth sitting with for a moment, because it suggests that crow intelligence is not just a fixed endowment inherited from parents. It is something constructed through experience, shaped by the particular world each individual crow inhabits, which means crow intelligence, like human intelligence, is in part a product of biography, of what happened to this crow, in this place, with these companions, over the course of this life. Crows near roads and cities have been observed using traffic to crack hard-shelled nuts. They drop walnuts onto pedestrian crossings, then wait for cars to run over them, then retrieve the broken shells during the red light. This behaviour was first documented in Japan in the 1990s, where carrion crows near Sendai had apparently invented it independently, and it has since been observed in crows in California, Washington, and elsewhere. Different crow populations apparently inventing the same technique separately. A convergence of solutions driven by convergent problems. What is particularly beautiful about the traffic walnut behaviour is the patience it requires. The crow must drop the nut, wait for a car, wait for the light to change, wait for the pedestrian crossing signal, then retrieve the food without being struck. The entire sequence can take several minutes, and requires the crow to inhibit the immediate desire to approach the food and instead wait for precisely the right moment. Impulse control, delayed gratification, long-term thinking. These are abilities that predict success in complex environments in every species that has been tested for them, including humans, and crows have them in abundance. There is a lovely little experiment that tested impulse control in corvids using a version of the classic marshmallow test, originally designed to measure delayed gratification in young children. In the children's version, a child is offered 1 marshmallow now or 2 marshmallows if they wait. The ability to wait, to resist the immediate reward for the larger future reward, turns out to predict all sorts of positive outcomes later in life. Patience, it seems, is a very powerful cognitive ability. In the corvid version of the test, jays were given a choice between eating a lower quality food immediately or waiting to exchange it for a higher quality food. The jays waited. Some waited for several minutes. The willingness to wait was correlated with other measures of cognitive flexibility, suggesting that impulse control in corvids, as in humans, is a general marker of higher executive function. A bird that can resist a worm in order to wait for a better worm is a bird that has some model of the future built into its decision-making. It knows that now is not the only moment, that other moments will come, and that what it does now will affect what those moments contain. That sounds philosophical when I say it. But it is also just a description of what the jay does. The philosophy is already in the behaviour. Let us spend a moment thinking about the relationship between crows and humans specifically, because it is unusually intimate and unusually long. Crows have lived near humans for a very long time. They are habitat generalists and dietary opportunists, which means they thrive wherever food is abundant and environments are varied. Human settlements have always been both of those things. Garbage heaps, agricultural fields, markets, roads, parks. Everywhere humans have gone in most parts of the world, crows have followed. Or perhaps more accurately, crows were already there, watching us arrive. This long cohabitation has shaped crows cognitively. Urban crows show higher levels of problem-solving performance than rural crows on many standardized tests. They are bolder, more exploratory, and more willing to engage with novel objects. The explanation is straightforward and a little humbling. The urban environment is cognitively demanding. There are more novel stimuli, more complex problems, more opportunities, and more threats. The crows that thrive in cities are the ones that can learn quickly, think flexibly, and keep their cool in the face of constant novelty. Cities have been, in a sense, an intelligence test for crows, and urban crows have been passing it for centuries. There is also evidence that crows track human activity in sophisticated ways. They know which garbage trucks follow which routes and when. They know which market stalls close at which hours. They know which humans carry food and which do not. They adjust their behaviour to human patterns of activity, with a precision that reflects genuine understanding of human predictability. Some individual crows have been observed bringing gifts to humans who regularly feed them. Small objects, pieces of glass, shiny metal, old buttons, left in the spot where food is usually provided. Whether these gifts are intentional, in the sense of being chosen specifically as exchange objects, or are simply displaced caching behaviour is not entirely clear. But the behaviour is consistent, and it occurs specifically towards specific humans who have provided consistent care. A crow that brings gifts to a particular person is a crow that has a particular relationship with a particular person. That relationship involves recognition, history, and behavioural adjustment. It is a friendship, at minimum in structure if not in inner life. And it is, by any measure, an extraordinary thing for a bird to have with a member of an entirely different species. There is a girl in Seattle whose story has become something of an internet legend. From the age of 4, she began leaving food out for crows near her home. The crows began leaving her things in return. Over the years, she accumulated a collection of small objects brought by her crow neighbours. A bit of broken glass polished smooth, a rusty screw, a small piece of blue plastic, a tiny charm, each one left where food had been, each one a kind of receipt. The girl, her name is Gabby Mann, grew up feeding those crows, and those crows grew up knowing her. When she fell and scraped her knee in the backyard, crows nearby called out in a way that her mother described as distinctly different from their usual calls. Whether they were expressing something or simply responding to an unexpected sound, we cannot say, but they noticed, and they responded. What would it mean to be known by a crow? To be one of the recognised faces in a crow's social map of its world? To be remembered not as a type, but as a person? There is something in that which feels like connection. Across the enormous gap between our very different kinds of minds, two creatures recognising each other, remembering each other, finding each other reliable, that is not nothing. In fact, it might be something rather important. Let's return now to the question of what crow intelligence tells us about the nature of mind itself, because I think it tells us something that is both deeply unsettling and deeply hopeful. The unsettling part is this. For most of human history, we have drawn a very sharp line between human minds and non-human minds. We have placed ourselves alone on one side of that line, uniquely rational, uniquely self-aware, uniquely capable of planning, language, culture, empathy, and moral understanding. And we have placed all other animals on the other side, driven by instinct, bounded by the present, without inner lives worth worrying about. Crows and corvids broadly, and many other animals whose cognition has been rigorously studied in recent decades, have been steadily dismantling that line. Not all at once, not completely. The line has not vanished. Human cognition is different from crow cognition in important ways, particularly in its reliance on language, its capacity for abstract symbolic thought, and its extraordinary cultural accumulation across generations. These are real differences and they matter, but the line is no longer where we thought it was. Crows plan for the future, crows understand other minds, crows have culture, crows form lasting relationships, crows grieve, crows play, crows have personalities, crows recognize faces and remember grudges and give gifts. These things are not human behaviors. They are not imitations of human behaviors. They are crow behaviors. They arose independently in a completely different lineage, shaped by completely different pressures, expressed through a completely different physiology. And they are real, which means that intelligence, and with it some form of inner life, is not the exclusive property of one kind of animal. It is something the universe produces wherever conditions call for it. It is in some sense a convergent solution to the problem of being alive in a complicated world. The hopeful part of this is the implication it carries. If minds like these exist in crows, then perhaps the world is richer in experience, in something that matters, than we have allowed ourselves to believe. Perhaps the crow watching you from the fence post is not simply processing stimuli. Perhaps it is aware, in its own way, of you. Perhaps the world is full of subjects, of perspectival centres of experience, stitched together into communities of understanding that we are only beginning to perceive. We don't know the answer to that. Consciousness is the hardest problem in all of science. We don't even fully understand what it is in ourselves. But the behaviour of crows invites the question, and inviting the question is the beginning of something important. It is the beginning of a more careful relationship with the living world. a relationship based not on the assumption that other animals are empty inside, but on the recognition that they might not be, that the crow calling from the rooftop might have something at stake, that its life might matter, not just as a data point in an ecological survey, but as a life. That is not a scientific conclusion, it is an ethical invitation. And I think crows have been issuing it for a very long time. In mythology and folklore, the crow and its close relatives appear again and again as figures of knowledge, trickery, and transformation. In Norse mythology, the god Odin kept two ravens, Hugin and Munin, whose names translate as thought and memory. They flew across the world each day and returned to tell him what they had seen. In the folklore of many indigenous cultures across North America, the raven is a trickster, a creator, a transformer, a figure of intelligence who changes things by being clever. In ancient Rome, the crow was sacred to Apollo, the god of prophecy, because crows were believed to carry messages and to know things before they happened. These traditions did not arise from nothing. They arose from careful observation. People who lived close to these birds, who depended on the natural world for survival, who watched and paid attention over lifetimes and generations, noticed something. They noticed the way crows behaved, the way they watched, the way they learned, the way they remembered, and they encoded that observation in story and symbol, the way knowledge gets preserved when you don't have laboratories. The myths were field notes, written in the language of meaning rather than the language of data, but pointing at the same thing. These birds are paying attention, these birds are thinking, something is happening behind those eyes. And now, several thousand years after Odin's ravens flew across the world of myth, researchers with video cameras and behavioral protocols and neuroimaging equipment and comparative psychology frameworks are arriving at the same conclusion. Something is happening behind those eyes. Something complicated. Something that challenges our most comfortable assumptions about what minds are for and who gets to have one. The crow has been watching us for millennia. We're only now beginning to understand what it has been seeing. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps you might carry with you one particular image. A crow, perched on a branch somewhere in a city or a forest, dark and still against a grey sky. Its head tilts slightly, one eye fixed on something below. It has been here before. It knows this place. It knows who comes here at what time. It has a memory that stretches back through many seasons, full of names it cannot speak but holds nonetheless. Faces it would know anywhere, places it associates with danger and with safety, companions it has spent years alongside, a mate perhaps, whose absence left a silence. The crow watches, the city moves below it, a child crosses the road. The crow notes this: the child is known. The child sometimes leaves food. The crow has brought the child small things in return. This relationship is part of the crow's world, a thread in the web of connections that gives that world its texture. The crow calls once, softly, not an alarm, not a summons, something quieter, something that functions in its own register like acknowledgement. Then it spreads its wings and goes. Whatever intelligence is, wherever it appears, in the large folds of the human brain or in the compact, precise circuitry of a walnut-sized crow brain, it tends toward the same things: curiosity, connection, memory. The strange compulsion to understand what is out there and to respond to it, not blindly but thoughtfully. We are not alone in this. We never were. The crows have known that longer than we have. Thank you so much for spending this time here tonight. If these quiet journeys through science and the natural world are the kind of thing that helps you rest or think, or simply gives you something gentle to carry into sleep, I'd be deeply grateful if you liked this video and subscribe to the channel. Every like, every subscription helps this small, curious corner of the internet find more people who might want to listen, and I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Leave a comment if you feel like it. I read them all. Until next time, sleep well, and maybe, tomorrow, give a crow a second glance. It is almost certainly already giving you one. Good night.